The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It had weight, pressing down on the floorboards and settling in the corners where the dust motes danced in the sparse afternoon light. It was the heavy, settled silence of absence, a quiet hollowed out by years of unfulfilled prayers. Elias McBride felt it most when he came in from the fields, his shoulders aching and his hands raw. He would look at his wife, Martha, and see the same silence reflected in her eyes, a landscape as vast and lonely as the prairie that stretched out from their front door. It was the year 1884, and their small farm was an island in a sea of grass, a testament to 5 years of hard labor that had yielded corn, calluses, and a profound, unshakable loneliness. Martha moved through her days with a quiet competence that masked the ache in her soul. She tended the chickens, kneaded the bread, and mended Elias's shirts with hands that yearned for a smaller, more fragile task. She had long ago packed away the tiny clothes she had sewn in the hopeful early years of their marriage, tucking them into a small wooden chest beneath their bed. But out of sight was not out of mind. Every time a new family settled within a day's ride, the news of a birth would eventually drift to them on the wind, another small twist of the knife in a wound that would not heal. They were good people, kind to the few travelers who passed their way and fair in their dealings, but their life was a two-person play performed on an empty stage, their love for each other, the only anchor against the tide of sorrow. Their routine was the bedrock of their existence. Sunrise brought chores, sunset brought a simple meal, and the darkness brought the crushing quiet. They spoke of the weather, the price of grain, the weakness in the west wall of the barn. They spoke of everything but the one thing that defined them, the empty space at their table, the child's laughter they would never hear echoing against the sod walls of their home. Elias worked the land with a grim determination, turning the soil as if he could bury his grief beneath it. But grief was a stubborn root. It always found its way back to the surface. Then the storm came. It was not the usual summer squall that swept across the plains with a dramatic flourish before moving on. This was different. The sky turned a sickening shade of bruised purple-green, and the air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange electric dread. The wind arrived first as a whisper, then a moan, and finally a demented shriek that clawed at the little cabin, threatening to tear it from its foundations. Rain and hail fell in a solid, blinding sheet, turning the world outside into a churning chaos of noise and violence. For hours, Elias and Martha huddled together by the cold hearth, listening to the world being torn apart. The groan and splinter of heavy timber told them the barn had not survived intact. They did not speak, they simply held on, two small figures against the wrath of a furious God. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a world scrubbed clean and utterly broken. The sky was a pale, innocent blue, a cruel mockery of the night's devastation. Their cornfield was a flattened ruin of mud and broken stalks. The west wall of the barn had collapsed, exposing its splintered ribs to the sky. A profound sense of defeat settled over Elias as he surveyed the damage. It felt like the final, definitive blow, all their work washed away in a single night. He was making his way toward the swollen creek at the edge of their property, checking the erosion on the banks, when he saw it. The ancient, gnarled cottonwood that had stood for generations had been torn from the earth, its massive root system exposed like the nerves of a pulled tooth. Tucked securely within the lattice of thick, dark roots, sheltered from the worst of the storm's fury, was a cradleboard. Elias froze, his mind refusing to process the sight. He approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cradleboard was beautifully made, of wood and stretched hide, adorned with intricate quillwork in patterns he did not recognize, and from within it came a soft, mewling cry. He knelt in the mud, his hands trembling as he reached out. Inside, swaddled in soft rabbit furs, was a baby, a perfect, dark-eyed infant with a thatch of fine black hair, its skin the color of warm copper. It stared up at him, its tiny face wrinkled in consternation, and let out another, more demanding cry. It was a native child, Cheyenne or Arapaho, by the look of the beadwork, left alone in the wreckage of the storm. There were no tracks, no sign of anyone. Just the child, the ruined land, and the deafening silence that had followed the tempest. He lifted the cradle board, his movements clumsy with awe and terror. The weight of it was both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. He carried the baby back to the cabin, his mind a whirlwind of questions with no answers. When Martha saw him at the door, her face drained of all color. She looked from the destruction outside to the impossible bundle in her husband's arms. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I found him," he said, his own voice hoarse, "by the creek, in the roots of the old cottonwood." He stepped inside and placed the cradle board on the table. For a long moment, they both just stared. Then, Martha seemed to awaken from a trance. She moved forward, her hands fluttering hesitantly before she reached in and gently lifted the baby from his confines. She held him against her chest, and a sound escaped her throat, a soft, choked sob that was equal parts grief and wonder. The silence in the cabin was broken. It was filled with the sound of a hungry baby's cry, and for the first time in years, it was a sound of life. The deep, hollow ache in Martha's soul was suddenly, miraculously filled. She looked at Elias, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a fierce, protective light dawning in them. In that moment, the ruined barn and the lost crop ceased to matter. The storm had taken nearly everything, but it had brought them this. The first few days were a blur of fearful, tender activity. The baby, they discovered, was a boy. He was healthy and strong, his cries robust, and his appetite fierce. Martha, who had thought her maternal instincts had long since withered and died, found them surging back with the force of a flood. She used the milk from their lone surviving cow, diluting it with boiled water as she'd heard others did, feeding the infant with a rag dipped in the warm liquid. She bathed him in the basin, her hands gentle on his soft skin. She sang to him, quiet, half-forgotten lullabies that came back to her like echoes from a distant dream. A light returned to her face that Elias had not seen since they were first married. Elias, however, remained on edge. He was a practical man, a man who understood cause and effect, and the baby's presence defied all logic. He found himself constantly scanning the horizon, watching the empty line where the prairie met the sky, expecting to see riders appear at any moment. "They'll come for him, Martha," he said one evening, his voice low as he watched her rock the baby by the fire. "His people, they won't have just left him." "The storm," Martha whispered, not taking her eyes off the boy's sleeping face. Perhaps they were caught in it. Perhaps they couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. He was placed in that tree to be safe. It was an act of love, Elias, not abandonment. Maybe, he conceded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. To take in a white child found in such circumstances would be one thing, but this was different. He knew the fear and mistrust that ran like a poisoned river between the settlers and the tribes. To be found with a native child, no matter the circumstance, could be seen as theft, as a crime. Yet, even as he worried, he found himself being drawn into the child's orbit. The baby's grip on his calloused finger was surprisingly strong. The way his dark eyes followed Elias around the small cabin chipped away at his reserve. One afternoon, while Martha was outside, he found himself sitting by the makeshift cradle, carving a piece of scrap wood into the rough shape of a bird. He didn't even realize he was doing it until the toy was finished. He placed it gently beside the sleeping infant, his heart giving a painful lurch. He was already lost. They fell into a new routine, one punctuated by the needs of the child. The silence of grief was replaced by a new kind of quieter, watchful, waiting peace. They didn't dare name him at first, as if doing so would be to claim something that was not theirs. They simply called him the boy. But as days turned into a week, and then two, with no sign of anyone on the horizon, the name felt increasingly wrong. One evening, Martha looked up from feeding him, her expression solemn. "His name is Daniel," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of faith. He was delivered from the flood. Elias looked at her, at the fierce love burning in her gaze, and then at the child held so securely in her arms. He saw the truth of it. This was their son now, in their hearts, no matter what came next. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Daniel," he repeated, the name feeling solid and right on his tongue. He finally let the hope, so long suppressed, bloom in his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future with a son, to teach, to raise, to leave this land too. The day it happened, the air was still and clear. Elias was working to salvage timber from the ruined barn when he felt it prickling on his skin, the instinct of a man who has lived long in open spaces. He looked up toward the low ridge that bordered their property to the north, and his blood ran cold. They were there, a line of riders, at least a dozen, sitting motionless on their horses. They were too far to see clearly, but he knew. Their stark silhouettes against the bright sky were unmistakable. Cheyenne warriors. They weren't attacking, they weren't making any threatening gestures, they were simply watching. A wave of pure terror washed over him. He dropped his hammer and ran for the cabin. "Martha," he yelled, his voice tight with panic. "Get inside. Bring Daniel. Bolt the door." She saw the look on his face and didn't question him. She snatched Daniel from his cradle, her movements swift and sure, and retreated into the dim interior of the cabin. Elias followed, his rifle in his hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He peered through a crack in the shutters. They hadn't moved. A silent, terrifying jury assembled on the hill. The vigil lasted the rest of the day. They did not approach. They did not leave. They were a constant, menacing presence that shrunk the world down to the four walls of the cabin. Every plan Elias had made, every hope he had allowed himself to feel, crumbled into dust. They had come for their child, and what would follow? Accusations, vengeance. He held the rifle, but he knew it was a useless token against so many. He and Martha were utterly, hopelessly alone. Night fell, and the silhouettes on the ridge melted into the darkness, but their presence remained, a palpable weight in the air. Elias and Martha didn't sleep. They sat in the dark, Daniel sleeping fitfully between them, and listened. Every rustle of the wind, every cry of a distant coyote sounded like approaching footsteps. The love they felt for the child was now inextricably bound with a paralyzing fear. "What do they want, Elias?" Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "They've come for him," he said, the words tasting like ash. "They were just waiting, watching us." He imagined them seeing his clumsy attempts at repair, their life of struggle. Perhaps they thought their child deserved better, or worse, perhaps they thought the worst of them. The sun rose the next morning on the same scene. The riders were back in their positions on the ridge, as if they had never left. The tension in the cabin had become a physical thing, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Elias looked at Martha's pale, exhausted face. He looked at Daniel, so small and innocent of the silent war being waged over him. He could not live like this. They could not spend the rest of their lives, however short they might be, cowering in their own home. He made a decision. It was born not of courage, but of desperation. He stood and placed the rifle against the wall. "What are you doing?" Martha breathed, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm going out there," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. We can't live like this. I have to talk to them." "They'll kill you." "Maybe," he said softly, "but hiding in here is its own kind of death." He touched her cheek, then laid a gentle hand on Daniel's head. "Stay inside. Keep the door bolted, no matter what happens." He unbolted the door and stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. He felt 100 eyes on him. He consciously kept his hands open and away from his body, a universal gesture of peace he prayed they would understand. He did not walk toward them with his head held high like a challenger, nor did he crawl like a beggar. He simply walked, one steady step after another, a farmer on his own land, going to meet his fate. As he neared the base of the ridge, one of the riders dismounted and walked down to meet him. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of seasons and sorrows, his long hair braided with grey. He carried no weapon in his hands. He stopped a dozen feet from Elias. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "The boy, we found him after the storm. He was alone. We have cared for him." The Cheyenne man, Vokin, did not seem to understand his words, but he understood the tone. His gaze was intense, searching. He looked past Elias, at the small cabin, at the ruined barn, at the flattened fields. Then he raised a hand and made a series of slow, deliberate gestures. He pointed to the sky and swept his arm in a violent circle, mimicking the wind, a storm. He then pointed toward the creek, to the spot where the great cottonwood had fallen. He made a shape with his hands like a sheltering tree, then held his arms as if rocking a baby. Finally, he looked at Elias, a question in his unblinking eyes. Elias understood. He nodded, pointing to himself and then to the cradle board, which was resting just inside the cabin door, visible from where they stood. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We found him." Vokin watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned without a word and walked back up the ridge to his men. Elias stood frozen, watching them confer. He had done all he could. He braced himself for the charge, for the violent reclamation of the child. He closed his eyes, expecting the end. But it didn't come. Instead, after a few minutes, the entire group of riders turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over the ridge as silently as they had appeared. Elias stood trembling, awash with a disbelief so profound it felt like a dream. He stumbled back to the cabin, his legs weak with relief. They were gone. They had left the boy. They had left them in peace. He and Martha held each other, weeping with a relief that was painful in its intensity. They had been judged, and somehow they had been spared. They thought it was over. They awoke the next morning to a strange sound. It was not the sound of wind or animals. It was the rhythmic, unfamiliar sound of work. Cautiously, Elias went to the door and peered out. His jaw fell open. The prairie was alive with people. The entire Cheyenne party had returned, but they were not on the ridge. They were on his farm, and they were working. A group of men, stripped to the waist, were swarming over the collapsed barn. With an efficiency that was both beautiful and unnerving, they were clearing the debris, salvaging usable timber, and setting aside the broken pieces. Another group was already starting to raise a new frame where the wall had collapsed. In the ruined cornfield, the women moved in a silent, graceful line, their hands methodically gathering any salvageable ears of corn the storm had missed and clearing the broken stalks. They worked without speaking, a community moving as one organism, their movements economical and purposeful. Elias and Martha stood in the doorway, utterly stunned into silence. This wasn't an attack, it wasn't a threat, it was help. They were rebuilding the farm. The silent vigil on the ridge had not been a threat, it had been an assessment. They had been watching the strangers who had their child, judging their character, their home, their circumstance. They had seen not kidnappers, but a poor farmer and his wife. They had seen people who were also victims of the same storm that had likely taken the life of Daniel's mother, leaving her only enough time to secure her son in the cradleboard and tuck him into the roots of the tree, her last desperate act of love. The realization washed over Elias with the force of a physical blow, humbling him to his very core. His fear, his suspicion, it all seemed so small and shameful now. These were not the faceless savages of frontier paranoia. They were people. They had lost one of their own, but they saw that her child had found a new home, and in an act of staggering grace, they had come not to take, but to give. After a long while, Martha, her face streaked with tears of awe, took a deep breath. She went back inside, picked up Daniel, and walked out into the sunlight. She moved with a purpose that mirrored the Cheyenne women in the field. She walked slowly toward an older woman who seemed to be directing the others. The woman, whose name was Mesa, had eyes that held the same deep sorrow and resilience as the land itself. She stopped her work and watched Martha approach. Martha stopped before her, holding Daniel out not as an offering, but as an introduction. Mesa looked at the baby, her weathered face softening. She reached out a gentle hand and touched Daniel's cheek. Then her gaze lifted to meet Martha's. In that look, a universe of understanding passed between them. There was grief for the daughter she had lost, gratitude for the safety of her grandchild, and an acceptance of the strange, new path his life had taken. She gave a small, solemn nod. It was a blessing, a relinquishment, a recognition of one mother to another. For 3 days, the Cheyenne worked. They spoke little to the McBrides, and Elias and Martha, understanding this was a language of action, not words, did not intrude. They simply brought out water and what food they could share. The offerings were accepted with quiet nods. The barn was not just patched, but made stronger than it had been before. The ruined field was cleared and made ready for a late-season planting. A massive pile of firewood was chopped and stacked by the cabin, enough to last them through the coming winter. On the morning of the 4th day, they were gone. They vanished as they had arrived, leaving behind a repaired farm and an altered world. Elias and Martha walked through their property as if seeing it for the first time. It was the same land, but it was no longer an island. They were connected now, in a profound and sacred way, to the people who truly belonged here. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the prairie, the cabin was warm and filled with a new kind of silence. It was the peaceful quiet of contentment. Elias sat by the fire, mending a piece of harness, while Martha hummed softly, rocking Daniel's cradle. He looked over at them, at the family he never thought he would have, in the home that had been rebuilt by an act of impossible kindness. The fear and the prejudice he had carried within him had been scoured away, replaced by a deep and abiding humility. They had been given more than a repaired barn. They had been given a lesson in grace. They had learned that community was not defined by the color of one's skin or the language one spoke, but by the shared burdens of hardship and the unexpected capacity of the human heart for compassion. The storm had brought devastation, but it had also cleared the way for a new life, a life of earned peace, a life of belonging. And in the center of it all was their son, Daniel, a bridge between two worlds, a living symbol of hope taking root in the most unlikely soil.